He read the invitation twice, standing in the kitchen of his Buckhead townhouse, holding a mug of coffee he had forgotten to drink. The card had arrived that morning, in a cream envelope, with gold full lettering, the kind of stationery that announced itself before you opened it. His name was written across the front in calligraphy, Terence Aldwell, and beneath it, in smaller print, the details of what the card called a celebration of professional achievement and new beginnings. It was a gala, his gala. He had organized it himself, through his assistant, through the events team at the Whitmore Group, through 3 separate vendors who had each been told the same thing: make it look like money, because the people attending would know the difference. He set the card down on the counter and picked it up again. He had sent the invitation to Selene Obi 6 days ago, not out of obligation, not out of some misguided sense of civility. He had sent it because he wanted her there. He wanted her to see what the room looked like now. The chandeliers, the guest list, the profile piece that Atlanta Business Chronicle was running the following Thursday. He wanted her to walk through those doors and understand, in a way that no conversation could have communicated, that the version of himself she had known, the version she had chosen to leave behind, was not the finished product he had expected her to decline. His assistant confirmed the RSVP on a Tuesday afternoon, leaving a note on his calendar that read simply, "Ms. Obi confirmed. +2. Terence stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard his landscaper maintained every 2 weeks. +2. He turned the phrase over in his mind. He had assumed she would come alone if she came at all. He had imagined her arriving in the dress she'd worn to his colleague's retirement dinner 4 years ago, the navy one, with the simple neckline, still graceful, still composed, but visibly outpaced by a room that had moved on without her. He had not imagined +2. Selene Obi had not always been the kind of woman who entered rooms the way she entered them now. There was a time. She did not like to dwell on it, but she did not pretend it had not existed, when she had been the woman who waited for someone else to walk in first, who stood near the edges of things, who had learned, growing up in a 2-bedroom apartment in East Point, with her mother and her grandmother, and a rotating series of electric bills that never quite got paid on time, that the safest place to be was somewhere that nobody was looking directly at you. She had been 24 when she met Terence, and 26 when she understood that he was not going to change. She had spent the 2 years in between trying to make something from the distance between those 2 facts. He was not a cruel man in any obvious way. He did not raise his voice. He did not belittle her in public. What he did was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to name. He forgot things she had built. He introduced her at events as his girlfriend, then as his partner, and then, after 3 years of living in the same house and sharing a financial advisor, as a friend who works in tech, as though her name and her work were 2 separate categories, neither of which required elaboration. She had founded NovaBridge Solutions at 29, in the 2nd bedroom of the house they shared. On a laptop she had bought with money saved from a consulting contract she'd landed without his knowledge because she already knew, by then, that telling him in advance would mean managing his skepticism before she could manage her own. NovaBridge built data infrastructure tools for mid-size healthcare organizations. The unglamorous, load-bearing work of making sure patient records moved between systems without falling into gaps. It was not the kind of business that generated cocktail party excitement. It was the kind of business that kept hospitals from losing people. By the time she left Terence, NovaBridge had 6 full-time employees and contracts with 4 regional health networks. By the time his gala invitation arrived in her office, it had 231 employees, contracts with healthcare systems in 22 states, and a valuation that a Forbes correspondent had described, in print, as quietly historic. Her assistant, a composed young man named Patrick, who had worked for her for 3 years and had never once shown surprise at anything, set the envelope on her desk without comment. Selene opened it, read it twice, and put it down. She looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline, at the buildings that had been under construction when she first moved into this office, and were now finished inhabited, lit from within. She thought about declining. The thought lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called her head of security. The Whitmore Group's event space occupied the top 2 floors of a building on Peachtree Street that had been renovated 3 times since the 1980s and still could not entirely escape the feeling of its original bones. The lobby smelled like fresh flowers and carpet cleaning solution. A string quartet played near the elevator bank. Guests arrived in a slow-dressed procession, venture partners and city council members, and a few faces from local television news. People who had learned how to hold a glass and sustain eye contact, and ask questions they already knew the answers to. Terrence stood near the welcome table, in a suit that had been fitted for this specific evening, talking to a man who ran a private equity fund and had, over the course of the past 20 minutes, said the word synergy 4 times without apparent irony. Terrence was listening and nodding, and occasionally saying absolutely in a way that he hoped sounded substantive, but a part of his attention was on the elevator doors. He had not told anyone about the invitation. Not his business partner, not the events coordinator, not the journalist from the Chronicle who was somewhere in the room with a notepad and a recorder. He had told himself this was because it was a minor detail, a private matter, nothing worth mentioning. But the truth, which he was aware of without fully examining, was that he had constructed a specific image in his mind, and he did not want anyone else in the room before the image arrived. The elevator doors opened at 7:43. Selene Obi walked out first. She was wearing a dress the color of deep burgundy, structured at the shoulder, with a hemline that moved when she walked in a way that suggested the fabric had been chosen by someone who understood the physics of rooms. She wore no jewelry except for a pair of earrings that caught the light, and her hair was pulled back in a style that required no further description because the rest of her commanded the description. Behind her, 2 steps back and one to each side, walked 2 men in dark suits. They were not large in the theatrical sense. They were precise. They moved the way people move when they have been trained to notice everything in a room before committing to a position within it. The string quartet continued playing. The conversations continued around the room. But there was a shift in the air that had nothing to do with the climate control system. A small, collective adjustment in attention. The kind that happens when something enters a space and changes the space without announcing an intention to do so. Terrence saw her from across the room. He had prepared for this moment. He had rehearsed in the private theater of his own mind the expression he would wear. Measured, welcoming, the look of a man who was gracious enough to include even those who had underestimated him. He had planned to cross the room at a moderate pace, extend his hand, and say something brief that would establish the terms of the evening. He did not cross the room. He stood where he was, holding his glass, while the man from the private equity fund continued saying words that Terrence no longer heard. Selene accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and moved through the room with the ease of someone who had attended many rooms like this and had stopped being impressed by them sometime around her 38th birthday. She was 43 now. She had been to galas in Houston and Chicago, and twice in New York, and once, memorably, in a repurposed textile warehouse in Detroit that had more interesting bones than anything on Peachtree Street. She recognized 2 people near the bar, a woman who ran a community development financial institution on the West Side, whom she genuinely liked, and a man she had been introduced to at a conference in Savannah, who had spent 20 minutes explaining to her what data infrastructure was. She moved toward the woman, whose name was Denise, and they embraced with the warmth of people who did not see each other enough. "I did not expect to see you here," Denise said, and the word "here" carried a small specific weight. "I was invited," Selene said simply. Denise looked at her for a moment. "Of course you were." They talked for a while about a grant program Denise's organization was piloting, and about a mutual friend who had recently relocated to Charlotte. Selene was fully present in the conversation. She was not scanning the room. She was not managing her expression. There was nothing to perform. One of the men who had arrived with her, his name was Darius, and he had been with her executive protection team for 4 years, positioned himself at a comfortable distance that would have looked, to the casual observer, like someone who simply happened to be standing nearby. The other, Marcus Webb, was near the room's secondary entrance, which Selene had identified when she walked in, because she identified secondary entrances in rooms the way she identified load-bearing walls in arguments, automatically, without drawing attention to the habit. The evening moved. Appetizers were passed. A brief presentation played on a screen at one end of the room, a reel of the Whitmore Group's projects, their portfolio companies, their charitable initiatives, their vision for the next decade. Terrence appeared in it 3 times, once speaking to camera in a way that had been coached, but not coached quite enough. A man Selene did not recognize leaned toward the woman beside him and said, "Is that the NovaBridge CEO?" The woman said she thought so. The man said, "The healthcare infrastructure company? She's worth—" "Yes," the woman said, in a tone that suggested she had known this for some time, and found his surprise slightly behind schedule. Terrence found her at 9:15, near the windows overlooking the street below. He had spent an hour and a half trying to find an approach that would feel natural, and had ultimately concluded that there was no natural approach, and that he should simply walk over, so he did. "Selene," he said. She turned from the window. "Terrence." There was a pause that lasted long enough to be specific. "You look well," he said. "Thank you." He gestured at the room with his glass, a practiced gesture, proprietary, meant to convey ownership without stating it. "I'm glad you came. I wasn't sure you would." "You invited me," she said. "I thought it was important to come." He had expected something slightly different in her tone, a trace of what he had been hoping for. Something that confirmed for him that the room, the guest list, the chronicle piece, the sum of the evening, had registered as intended. But her voice was level in the way of someone who had genuinely assessed a situation and found it proportionate to her interest, not overwhelming to it. "NovaBridge is doing well," he said. He had not meant to say it quite so directly. It came out as though he had meant it as a compliment, but it landed differently. "Yes," she said. "It is. I heard about the Carver Health System contract. That's—" He paused. "That's significant. It took 2 years to close," she said. "We rebuilt their entire interoperability architecture, 47 legacy systems. It was not a small project." "No," he said. "I imagine not." He was looking at her the way people look at something they thought they had put away and have just found again in a drawer, not quite sure whether they are glad it is there or unnerved by it. He had built this evening to demonstrate something. He was standing in the demonstration and finding that the measurements were off. "I want you to know," he began, and then he stopped, because the sentence had multiple possible endings, and he had not chosen one before he started. Selene waited. "I want you to know that, what we had, what you contributed," he stopped again. "You weren't given enough credit. I didn't." "Terrence," she said, with a patience that was not unkind, "you don't need to do this here." "I know," he said. "But you've been thinking about how this evening would go," she said. "I know. I thought about it too." He looked at her. "I'm not here because I'm angry," she said. "I'm not here to prove anything to you. I came because you sent an invitation, and because I thought it might be good for both of us to be in the same room and discover that it's—" She glanced briefly toward the window, toward the lights of the city below. "Not as significant as either of us made it in our heads." He was quiet for a moment. Somewhere behind him, a server offered someone else champagne, and the someone accepted. "I built NovaBridge in your house," she said, and this was a statement of fact, not an accusation. "In the second bedroom. On the Lenovo you said wasn't worth buying because I'd never stick with it." He had forgotten the Lenovo. The memory arrived now, small and precise, and he felt the particular discomfort of a man who has told himself a story about himself for long enough that encountering a contradicting detail is briefly disorienting. "I know," he said. "I don't want an apology," she said. "I didn't come for one." She looked at him steadily. "I came because I wanted to see if I was still carrying this, and I'm not." So that's actually useful to know. He did not say anything. She picked up her sparkling water from the windowsill, where she'd set it and turned slightly, a small movement that was not a goodbye, but was a complete sentence. It was the man from the Chronicle who created the moment that the room would remember. He had spent the better part of the evening working his way through the guest list, recording brief comments on his phone, writing in a narrow notebook he kept in his breast pocket. He had gotten Terrence's formal quote earlier in the evening. He was, by 9:30, looking for color, the kind of detail that turns a profile into something people actually finish reading. He found it near the bar, where a small cluster of guests had formed the kind of conversation that happens when people who know the same thing from different angles end up in the same place. One of them was a woman who worked in health policy, another was a man who ran a regional hospital network, and the third was Selene, who had drifted there after her conversation with Terrence and was now in the middle of explaining, with the technical precision of someone who had thought about nothing else for 15 years, why the current approach to health data exchange was structurally inadequate. The problem isn't storage, she was saying. It never was. The problem is that the organizations holding the data don't share a common definition of what the data means. NovaBridge built the translation layer. That's not a metaphor. It's literally a semantic translation infrastructure that sits between systems and makes them legible to each other. The man from the Chronicle stopped walking. He had done his research before the gala. He had read the Forbes piece. He knew who she was. What he had not anticipated was that she would be here, in this room, at this man's event, speaking with the assurance of someone who owns the floor she is standing on even when it belongs to someone else. He looked across the room at Terrence, who was talking to a city council member and had his back partly turned, and he looked back at Selene. He made a note in his narrow notebook. It was a long note. The profile ran the following Thursday. The headline was about Terrence. The most shared paragraph was about Selene. She left at 10:30, before the formal program ended, because she had a 7 a.m. call with the team in Denver, and because she had done what she came to do, which was, as she had told Terrence, to determine whether she was still carrying something. She was not. Darius brought the car around. The second member of her team fell in beside her as she moved through the lobby toward the exit. The string quartet had been replaced by a DJ playing something she didn't recognize, low and insistent. In the lobby, a woman she had never met stepped forward and touched her arm lightly. "I'm sorry to stop you," the woman said. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, wearing a blazer over a simple dress, with the look of someone who had something to say and had been deciding for the past 20 minutes whether to say it. "I'm Renata Bliss. I've been following NovaBridge since the Series B. My mother was a nurse for 30 years, and the things you've built, the way data works differently now in the hospitals she worked at." She stopped, then steadied herself. "I just wanted to say thank you. In person." Selene looked at her for a moment. She thought about the second bedroom. She thought about the Lenovo. She thought about the first time a hospital administrator called her to say that their new system had flagged a medication conflict that the old system would have missed, and that the patient was still alive because of it. She thought about the woman in East Point who had taught her, without meaning to, by the specific texture of her own exhaustion, that the world did not reward waiting. "Thank you for telling me that," Selene said. And she meant it in the fullest sense of the phrase, with nothing underneath it except itself. She walked through the lobby doors and out into the Atlanta night, and the city was exactly what it had always been. Indifferent, vast, full of lit windows, and she moved through it the way she moved through everything now, without apology, without hesitation, without the particular weight she had arrived carrying and had, somewhere between the 7th floor and the lobby, finally set down.